Hey there. Before you are about to dive into one of the episodes for our Maternal Mental Health series, make sure that you have subscribed to our podcast on Spotify, the podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, we would appreciate if you spread the word and recommend or even forward this episode or the whole podcast in general to another parent or to anyone who you think should be listening to this. If you find yourself asking, how can you support us? The easiest way to do this is to give us a follow on Instagram at Damn Parenting Podcast and to rate us with 5 stars on the platform that you're listening to this. We hope you know you're not alone on this parenting journey and you enjoy the following episode. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Damn Parenting, your English-speaking parenting podcast from Amsterdam. And we are your hosts, Maren
and Eva.
This is another episode within our Maternal Mental Health month of May. And today we will touch upon a topic that is very present in our lives or in the lives of our circle, but is not often talked about because it's still a topic that a lot of people don't feel the courage to talk about or come forward. Or we will be talking about the topic of miscarriage today. So if this is a topic that you feel sensitive about and don't want to listen to, then this is the time to pick another episode, or you listen to this episode with a friend. So make sure that you are in a good state to listen to this episode for the next around 30 minutes. And of course, we have brought someone back that we appreciate so much talking with us about these hard topics. And we have brought Ilena back. Hi, Ilena.
Hello. What a lovely introduction.
And I wanted to say a couple of numbers. So around 20% of all known pregnancies end with a miscarriage. However, the real number is probably a lot higher because a lot of people don't even recognize a miscarriage because sometimes it happens so early on that it's just a heavy bleeding and irregular period, like something that's just off that we wouldn't identify as a miscarriage, but technically under medical standpoints would count as. So around 20%. So it is a high number. So most likely, if not you have gone through this, you most likely know someone consciously or unconsciously who has gone through that process. And today we want to shed a little bit of light on it, how to get support within the Dutch system from a medical standpoint, but also from a psychological standpoint. How can we deal with this process and what are the best ways to, resolve this topic for ourselves so we can move on into the next chapter after we've experienced this. So what are some healthy coping mechanisms or strategies for processing the emotional pain and grief associated with miscarriage, Ilena?
Yeah, well, it's such a complex topic, of course, and it's one of those topics, like anything that's a little bit challenging emotionally, that it's such a subjective process to go through. Sometimes it's helpful to really look at the fact that miscarriage is the cessation of a pregnancy, and the cessation, again, here, some of the complexity. It depends if you look at a pregnancy before 12 weeks or between 12 and 16 weeks as viable life in the first place, but it is somehow the loss of life. It is the loss of pregnancy, and that can then provoke deep feelings of grief. So I think that's a helpful place to start, that recognizing that the loss of a pregnancy is a process of grieving. It's a process of grieving life if you believe that it was life, but even if you don't believe it's life, the promise of a pregnancy, the promise of a baby is the promise of a new chapter of your own life. So at the very least, it is also then grieving of an imagined future, grieving of an imagined new family member. And, that is, again, slightly more complex process of grief because many times in a miscarriage, you won't even see the embryo or the fetus. It will look like clumps of tissue rather than a fetus or an embryo. And when grief is of an imagined life phase or an imagined person, a hoped for, longed for person, that makes it difficult because there's very little to hold on to. There's very little aspects of it that are really palpable. And that's why I would say speaking to a professional, a counsellor or a psychologist who has plenty of experience guiding people through a process of grieving. And again, I know we spoke about this before, but as a group of women, we believe in women's ability to identify what kind of professional would be best suited to how they want to process that and how they want to talk about it. But grief really is a fundamental piece of most people's processing. And of course, we probably also know a lot of different women who have experienced miscarriage as a traumatic event. And then, if there are parts of that experience that are reflected back upon as a traumatic experience, or it's becoming difficult over time to resolve parts of that experience, then it can also be helpful to bounce towards a professional who can support you in resolving the traumatic elements as well. But generally, even if you're not in a position to seek support from a professional, I guess a good place to start is acknowledging for yourself that it's a deep, profound loss, and carving space in your life, in your agenda, to mark that loss.
Can we also touch on some women who unfortunately will go through multiple miscarriages, how that would be for them?
Yeah, this is such a tricky one. I know lots of people personally, but also very much professionally, who've been through multiple losses. And it's a hard one because, the very human reaction as we hold space for other people in our lives or through our work is that horrible sense of, oh, this is so unfair. How could this happen? And when it is happening multiple times, they are individual processes of grief, but they are also compounded experiences of grief. And I guess professionally, then I would really encourage people to seek professional help, because that process of compounded grief becomes then even more complex. And certainly when we're dealing with a topic like miscarriage, if multiple losses are occurring, the likelihood is that you're simultaneously in a process of consciously trying to conceive a baby. And when compounded grief is left kind of floating or uncontained or unheld, that can make the process of trying to conceive kind of extra challenging. So I really would encourage people to seek professional help when multiple losses are happening. It's absolutely not unusual. With each additional loss, there would need to be more and more time spent processing, or conversely, there is also, for some people, a sense of a kind of acclimatization to the loss, so that actually then the instinct would almost be, this is so painful, I can't spend time with this, I'm just going to focus on the fertility part and ignore the grief. And then, of course, sometimes those people will successfully go on to be pregnant, and often, unfortunately, in pregnancy or in the days, weeks before birth, or immediately after birth, that is often then when the compounded grief can really begin to kind of cascade and explode out, because birth then and postpartum is such a huge experience, and all those layers of protection that helpful for us in our day-to-day life, they're kind of peeled away, and our vulnerability is exposed in that time. So perhaps that's helpful to say that it's a helpful preventative choice to invest the time and energy kind of as you go along, rather than trying to bury it. But equally said, I have no judgment about people who do try and bury it and get on with the complexities of a fertility journey too. I guess there's not really actually a right or wrong way.
And when we think about those who've also had the previous miscarriages but are actually now pregnant, is there something that they should also take into consideration?
Yeah, well, again, checking in with how you are feeling and what is alive for you is really helpful. I know on intake forms at hospitals with gynecologists or with midwives, I know also in my own intake form as a doula, I do ask new clients, if they've experienced loss. I do believe that it can be very helpful to explain to a provider or a supporter that you have experienced loss, however you stand. Yeah, if it feels like it's an integrated part of your journey and it's not emotionally triggering and it's not causing additional anxiety, or there are no thought patterns that are prompting back to the loss, even if that's not happening, it can be very helpful to make it clear to your supporters and providers that there has been loss in your history. Because realistically, we do see that in the process of those final days, final hours before giving birth, or during birth, or in the immediate hours after birth, or the months in the fourth trimester, or even on the anniversary of losses after you've given birth with a living baby, then those anniversaries and those moments can flood in a new way, because the welcoming of a new family member, of course, can give a new context or depth of experience to the loss that touches a new layer. I should explain to people listening that I'm now working with my hands to signal layers, like an onion skin, an epidermis, that, like we said about protective layers being peeled back. When you are in the aftermath of postpartum, you're holding a baby in your arm, and then you go through the anniversary of a loss, it does take on a new perspective often. So it's helpful if supporters and carers already know, so that you don't have to explain the whole story from scratch, and that you can pick up that thread and be witnessed and be held, be heard.
I guess it's also the thing of awareness, that if I know that my client, whoever I am as a provider, has gone through that, then if I identify that, and then I can really address that topic, and it's not so much of, all right, there's something going on, we don't know exactly what, so let's start pushing here,
Yes.
and maybe someone gets diagnosed with postpartum depression, but then it's not the right help, and then they go down the road, well, I've been diagnosed with this and I've been seeking help, but it's still not resolved. I still don't feel better. So I guess this is really helping to, if I have it on the radar as a provider, then I can address it, even if I ask, and then the mother can say, oh, thinking back, yeah, actually this is what's coming on, or no, it's not. But like you said, creating the awareness around it.
Yeah, it's a huge piece, and sometimes it can also be very pragmatic, actually, that if it is okay and safe for a care provider or a supporter and the pregnant person to discuss the loss, it might be a part of a discussion about the preparation for labor pain. A question might be, I know in the intake we discussed the fact that you'd experienced this miscarriage, and I hear now today that you're talking about your fear of labor pain, and perhaps it's helpful for us to discuss how the physical experience of your miscarriage was for you, how you took care of yourself and what worked for you then in that process, and how we can use that experience to inform how we care for you now in this upcoming birth. And also that's a segue into, how is it going to be to experience physical sensations that might be similar to their experience? Because sometimes we can talk very pragmatically about things, almost like a defense mechanism, that we don't want to go into those deeper layers, but that then actually when we begin to really think what could happen with those very similar physical sensations, could that be triggering? And if it is there anything that the care provider can know sensitively about you to help? Maybe you gave the baby a name, or maybe there is a memento from the pregnancy that you have that could be a part of your special items that you take in your birth bag to kind of remind you about the journey that it took you to get there. And that I recognize that might sound macabre to some people, but sometimes part of the emotional journey of going through birth can also be to herald back to those significant life events that brought you to this live pregnancy, this live birth. And it can be on multiple layers, very healing, very helpful to give the loss a place alongside the birth of the baby here today. And, Eva, going back to your initial question, it can really be that with that sign of that positive pregnancy test this time round, that there's then a sense of looming anxiety about reaching the point in the pregnancy where a previous pregnancy or a previous loss occurred. And then very helpful to know who you can turn to just say in a prenatal appointment or on a WhatsApp message to your sister, we're coming close to that day and I just feel 1,000,001 emotions, and I just need you to know that that's what's happening, and just think of me and beam in some good juju right now, because it's heavy. It can be as simple as that, but giving it a place is the objective of grief work. Yeah.
That was one thing you just mentioned there. I'm just wondering, is there a path that women can take looking at various counseling or therapeutic approaches that help them bring them on the steps? Because obviously you're not going to go straight maybe to the trauma psychotherapist like straight away, but maybe is there certain ways maybe we could start to see, hey, someone else says, actually, I think you need more help, or maybe just a few chats is just giving you the peace and the being seen and being heard space.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I was talking with my very good friend Chandela, who I know is talking to you lovely ladies in a couple of days. But I was also just clarifying for her my understanding of the system and how that works in terms of the protocol of what happens when a miscarriage happens. And also then about this particular aspect, how they are kind of officially guided as midwives to signpost extra help. And actually for the psychological side, unless there is an indication that it's been a traumatic experience, and that there is then a kind of second line indication for psychological support for the traumatic elements of the experience, in which case, of course, EMDR is a wonderful tool often. Actually, I don't want to say it's a free-for-all, because that's not, it sounds a bit derogatory, but actually what I mean then is there are different avenues which have very nuanced little differences. So, for example, you do have some counselors or coaches that are specialized in loss, but loss as a part of a journey towards successful fertility. Usually, I would say people operating in that space should be able to carve out the grief piece, or should be able to carve out really holding space and counseling around the specific experience itself. But it is handy, I think, before women begin to look for support, if there is the capacity to reflect with a friend or reflect with their partner, or just kind of journal a little bit themselves, to try to begin to grasp which part of the experience is really the focus, or the particularly troubling bit. I'm pausing because I'm also aware that actually in that moment, sometimes it's very, very difficult to see that, but it never ceases to amaze me when I am supporting families in this situation, that actually the clarity that can come with a shock and a sudden grief like this can be also incredibly lucid. So, be discerning if you're listening to this and you're in that situation. Are you very lucid and very clear about which particular part of the process you need help with? Or do you need a good generalist who holds space for different elements of the experience, and then who can offer a little bit of guidance for you to find your way? And maybe that is a good first question when people reach out to professionals. Are you specialized or focused in a particular element of this experience of loss, or do you cover the wide spectrum of an individual miscarriage or multiple miscarriages, or are you focused more on fertility and the path to conception? And sometimes it might really be that initially you need some help with the grief, and then 3 months' time, 6 months' time, a year later, you need another person who's not associated with that initial first aid, and who you can begin to look to as the guiding light towards a new stage of the journey.
So for many of our listeners, we obviously created this podcast for our international families. So the Netherlands is not their home country. It's not something they're going to be fully aware of. So can you shed light on some support groups or online communities or resources that you could actually let people know where they can actually go for things about miscarriage related trauma?
Yeah. So one differentiation I do just really want to make is that a miscarriage doesn't necessarily need to be traumatic. And I think that's the beauty of the invitation to really look at doing grief counseling, that actually doing grief counseling or grief coaching can really support you in making sure that this experience doesn't become an unresolved traumatic experience, but sometimes it is traumatic. And, you know, some years ago in 2017, I was approached by a big community called Amsterdam Mamas to write a piece about miscarriage for expats in the Netherlands. And perhaps it's helpful for us to include that in the show notes, because there I have a list of links which are still very much relevant for online addresses for support. Those links range from a wonderful organization called Still Birthday. And I put, even though, you know, alphabetically it doesn't make sense, in that article, I did put that address first, because what I really appreciate about that organization is that it really honors the fact that a miscarriage or infant loss, there is somehow a celebration of life happening too. And I'm aware that for many people who've been in a journey of loss, this might really not resonate. It might be a long way away from the way that they want to look at this or their experience of this. But the reality is, a pregnancy that occurs even when it results in miscarriage, or a pregnancy that occurs and results in infant loss. And here the differentiation is that if the pregnancy ends after 24 weeks, then it is referred to as infant loss. There is still that miraculous life force energy that has taken root in the womb. And maybe I'm looking at this in a very, very idealistic way because of what I do for a living, but Still Birthday honors that crazy duality that we experience in parenthood, that it is a sign of vital life force energy. It is, in some cases, some people need to see the miscarriage as a birth. And so there is acknowledgement of that side, as well as the deep grief of the loss and the grief that comes along with the loss. So that's that's a global organization, and there are all kinds of free resources that can be downloaded. They have a list of different Still Birthday trained and certified practitioners that operate all over the globe, so that's great. Facebook has lots of different groups for miscarriage and loss as well. As a result of writing that article for Amsterdam Mamas, I did open a group that is specifically designed for expats here in Amsterdam, but also in the Netherlands, to support them through the process of loss specifically. Although I do notice in that group, there is often, sadly, families who've experienced multiple losses who also then go into that group to discuss signposting and options and possibilities for fertility journeys, fertility consultations. And what's been particularly touching for me over the last 7 years there is also that some people really stay in the group in the longer term, and they come back sometimes 2-3 years later to share their fertility joy. It's just another one of those examples, right, of women so eager and so ready to support other women through these sometimes super turbulent life experiences that we experience as women and experience as mothers. So I don't want it to be promotional at all, but I am really proud of the fact that group is really supportive and safe. Well, as safe as I can judge it to be safe, but that it is a very nurturing space.
What's the name of it?
To go to. It's called Expat Miscarriage Support in Amsterdam, and it's linked in the article that I'll send you. And maybe we can put a little link to that group separately from the article that we'll share as well. And then there are other Dutch organizations as well. So there are Dutch organizations, and again, with an online search, perhaps it also feels a little bit less loaded, that you can really look into somebody's website to see which parts of grief or miscarriage or loss people are specialized in, and they can do that without necessarily having the pressure of a phone call or the pressure of an email exchange. Because especially, I mean, I notice a difference in the 10 years that I've been working alongside pregnancy, birth, bereavement, and parenthood. It is becoming a lot less taboo, rightly so. So many women experience this. So there are, fortunately, lots of different groups, pages, resource bodies available for support online. Yeah.
Okay.
When you mention that we bring this topic also with this episode more and more into the conversation and take it out of this whole taboo, and this is something that, first of all, you're to be blamed for, or you should be feel guilty of, and don't talk about it. Let us know when you're pregnant, and then we can enjoy that. What advice do you have for someone who wants to come forward with this and communicate this with loved ones, family, maybe even their children that already exist, and maybe they have been aware of, oh, there's a pregnancy coming and now we have to deal with this as a family? What can women do to communicate this with their family or their friends? And also, equally, what can we as friends do when we hear this message, and how can we support best?
I have a friend from the UK who actually wrote a book about miscarriage, and it's called There Was a Baby. I'll find a link for that book. There are other books as well. And of course, I think we're all aligned when we safely say we can defer to women's wisdom on choosing age-appropriate resources to inform their children. But again, here, I really encourage discernment that sometimes that process needs to happen in real time because their grief is overwhelming and there are lots of tears, and there needs to be some context in the dynamic of the family about why there are so many tears. And sometimes it can be necessary to begin the trajectory of grief work already so that you feel a little bit more galvanized and ready to have those conversations. So, just have a little think and reflect. How can I make a choice here that's in keeping with my values and in keeping with the dynamic and communication style of our family, whilst keeping me as safe and healthy as possible? And again, I guess the same lens of discernment can also be applied to how you choose then to communicate that to your family. Literally yesterday with a friend who is just experiencing another loss, and she's also anticipating a family visit. So 10 days ago was anticipating how she was going to share the joyful news. And unfortunately, in the last few days now, is trying to work out how she's going to share this bittersweet news, right? And that can be really hard. And sometimes it's really helpful to discuss with your partner or journal for yourself how you want to share it, and feel free, like we say with birth and other news in our lives as parents, or information about our cycles or our fertility journeys, be really boundaried when you share it. You can really share what has happened and really say, hey, I have something really painful I'd like to share with you. And I would like to preface it by saying, I don't want any advice. And right now, here today, we're sat in this cafe. I don't want you to hug me or touch me because I'm only just about holding it together. But what I would like is for you to know, and maybe once I've got home, you can share with me the words of condolence that you might have for me, because right now, this is how much I can receive, and this is the dynamic with which I wish it to be received in. And as I know you've spoken about so beautifully with Naomi, sometimes people are going to respond to that really well, and they're going to really adhere to the boundaries that you set. Sometimes, sadly, they're going to trample all over them, and you can then reset the boundaries or leave or circle back to those boundaries and reaffirm them in the more mid to long-term process of dealing with that grief. And in terms of how we hold space, I guess a similar premise is also helpful. When somebody shares that really sad, bittersweet news that they've experienced a pregnancy which has resulted in loss, if that news is shared without any advice or boundaries about how they wish you to hold it, I guess the first thing is, pretty paramount that we express how sorry we are, how sad we are to hear that that's happened. Then we also say, it's so hard to hear such sad news, and I really want to honor you and be here for you in the way that you want me to be here. How can I best show up for you in this moment? Can I hug you? Can I hold your hand? Do you prefer me to not? And in the midterm, how can I best be there for you? Can I bring you a lasagna round when I make it on Tuesday? Can we go for coffee next week so that we can mark the week in between today and next week so that you can see that you're dealing with this really beautifully? Shall I drop you a message? If you've got some nice aromatherapy at home, can I make you an aromatherapy blend? But we can defer to women to let us know what they need. And of course, sometimes that also might mean that somebody's so lost that they might say, I really don't know. And then we can also say, totally understandable. Let me ask you again in 2 or 3 days if you've got any ideas. And if I've got some ideas, I'll pop them by and you let me know if it's helpful.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you very much. It's not been an easy episode, I have to say.
No.
I think anyone who's made it to this stage of listening to this episode, thank you for staying with us. We hope that this is going to also be helpful moving forward in case you ever do meet someone or know someone. You now know the power that you have to actually help them as well. And yeah, as you said, holding space for people is paramount. And it's also a gift that many of us have. Thank you, Ilena, for joining us on our maternal mental health series and really talking about a subject, as you say, many of us don't talk about.
Indeed. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I feel really honoured that you trust me to be here to discuss something so tender. And I just want to say again how much I appreciate the fact that you two are doing this work and holding space for so many women in this way. I think it's really valuable and really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.